grant was, so Rita and I are sort of different fields, and my field is behavior analysis, which is generally a more quantitative field. So if there are questions about some of the things, just know that I'm coming kind of from that perspective of being a quantitative researcher, but also in a field that is, everyone says that their field is niche, right? But behavior analysis is a little bit outside of the typical psychology educational fields. And so there's a bit of translation that has to happen when doing these kinds of grants, which I think is true for most fields, but kind of keeping that in mind when you're writing about this process of translating things that are maybe slightly outside of or not generally agreed on. That's going to happen for everyone. So kind of keeping that in the back of your mind as you're writing to a more broad audience. So before you start writing your grant, some of the things that I think can really set you up for success is one, using the available resources we have already at Western. So if you feel like you need pilot projects done, or particular small pieces of the research that are going to give you a publication or a presentation that will make your research a little bit stronger, taking advantage of those. So like the internal, the $5,000 round level grants, the university-wide grants, there's the SSHRC, which are around 25,000, and then going from there and thinking about the insight development, and then perhaps that's going to be your starting ground for a larger insight grant. One of the other things to think about is collaborators. A lot of the granting agencies are very interested in interdisciplinary work. And for me, I think that was a big positive in the grant that I put together. I worked with Anton Puviraja, who's from curriculum studies, and I'm from the applied psychology. And I think this pairing was really nice to bring together two fields, as well as draw on expertise that I didn't have. So knowing where you have limitations and finding people to support that application, either as co-investigators or as collaborators, is going to make a strong grant. So, you know, some fields might be more used to working in smaller teams, but I don't think that grants necessarily give better scores or see you better as being able to do it all on your own. If you have those people that support, that makes it really strong. Thinking about getting some granting experience by being a co-investigator or collaborator on other grants. So if there's someone more senior that can mentor you or add you to their grants because you might contribute a piece, that's a good idea. Get your publications out, get your presentations out if they're relevant to the work. Read examples of successful ones. I know the research office is great at having some databases of those. I'm happy to show you pieces of mine if you want to read, but taking a look at different ones that have been successful, and then talking to the research office and making sure that you're thinking about timelines and review deadlines and ROLA and all of that, so it's not down to the last minute and you're sending out scrambled emails that I'm sure Jen doesn't appreciate getting on I really need this submitted by X time. So then when you get to writing, these sound really simple, but I think when we're overwhelmed with a whole bunch of stuff to write, we sometimes forget or lose track of what we're actually writing. So answer all the questions and address all the criteria. print it out, put it in front of you, make a document, make bullet points, and keep cross-referencing, especially the evaluation criteria. Anything you write in your application, try and link it to something that's in that criteria. So don't put in extra stuff, don't miss things, but make sure you're matching onto that evaluation criteria. And there's no harm in using their language. So if they have unique phrasing in the evaluation criteria, bold it, italicize it, highlight it for the reviewers so that they can see that you've actually addressed that. There's no harm in being too explicit for the reviewers. And I'm sure Deanna will tell you about how many they have to review and how much time they have and when they appreciate certain things. Perry said that I wasn't going to put things copied and pasted from their website, but I did. But I'm not going to actually spend the time going through this. I just wanted to highlight something, which is this is the evaluation criteria, which you can, this is what I'm saying, to have sort of near you, in front of you, making bullet points for. But then comparing that to how they say to write your detailed description, it's different. So the pieces that they say are essential in your detailed description don't map onto the evaluation criteria perfectly, and almost don't, I don't think, set your reader up and set yourself up for success in terms of the order that they presented. So for me, I think staying closer to the evaluation criteria is important. Of course, put the pieces in, but if we look at how they say to do the detailed description, they have the objectives, and then there's a lot of context piece, and then the methods. And I think this approach, you're going to lose your readers a bit if you don't tell them what you're going to do early on. So if you spend a lot of your detailed description going through background and context and theory without actually saying what your research is going to be, it's going to be hard for those evaluators to figure out exactly what you're doing quickly. And when they revisit it, it's going to be hard for them to find that information again. So my suggestion is start your grant, your detailed description, with a clear outline that's really short, and then go into that background kind of methodology. So what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? What's going to be the effect? Almost like a little abstract at the beginning, and then break that down again so that you have that. And then repeat that piece in your summary, because the summary is going to be really important for revisiting your methodology. They're not going to keep going through your 6 pages. So what you're planning to do, how you're planning on doing it, and then what's going to be sort of the effect or the impact of your research in that. And put that at the beginning and set people up for success for all that background that you're going to go into. Other things that I think are helpful, a really clear aims or purpose that you can then link to your methods. These are just the examples from mine. I'm really boring, and all my purposes are the effect of blank on blank. And all my titles for all my articles are the effect of X on Y. But if you can have a clear purpose, and even I often put how I'm going to address that purpose with a little line underneath, like this aim will be addressed using a waitlist control trial kind of piece. That's really brief at the beginning. That's going to be helpful. For your methods, tying it really closely to your budget. And I, in my writing will list specific budget lines within the methodology. So if I said I'm getting funding for a research assistant, RA1 is going to do this work. If there's not enough detail in your methodology or it's hard to follow, I think that's going to result in some unsuccess for you. I don't know if that's a word, but now it is. And then don't forget about the analysis piece. Sometimes we get so excited about methodology that we neglect to say how we're going to actually analyze those data. So especially in my field, the approach that we use for methods and analysis is not well known in other psych fields. So I take some time to talk about what that is and use like evidence-based criteria and analysis reporting guidelines to support why I'm doing that. Use lots of concrete examples. And then budget, make sure that you have everything that you need, justify, and don't just throw in things because it says you can have up to 75,000. So I'm going to try and meet that number. Make sure that the things you're putting in are actually required for it. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, they will cut your budget if they're up to a certain amount if there are things that are over. At least that's what I thought they did. But if it's over by a certain number, then you just fail. So there's like a small range that they will deal with. And then after that, you fail. And Deanna is nodding, so she will tell you that for sure later on. Other little tips, thinking about writing for your audience. I kind of alluded to this, but the people reading it, for me, the people reading it were not behavior analysts. They probably were a mix of education and psychology. And so anything that is specific to your field, make sure that it's readable for those outside of your field, or using terms that have fairly generally agreed upon meanings. Kind of thinking of like an educated, but not necessarily well-versed sort of audience member. And then also imagine that they don't have a lot of time. So putting in really complex writing is going to be annoying for them. And then just after your writing, so you've got sort of this methodology, you've got your detailed description written. One, draw on your peers. I know I've reviewed SSHRC grants for other people, which I think is a really helpful thing for me as a writer as well. So reviewing my colleagues' SSHRC grants, I think has made me a better grant writer, and seeing what makes it easy for them, what makes it hard for them. And especially, I think in our faculty, you have this great benefit because you have such a diverse set of researchers that sending to someone in our faculty, you get really that idea of what's this educated non-field expert think about my work. And then the other thing is just keep applying, because even if they deny you on the first round, you're going to get some feedback. You can alter it. You can use some of the pieces of that grant for other grants. So just keep going, aim high, and then you have a piece of work that you can keep reusing and get feedback on and keep improving. So those are my reflections, and I'm going to toss it over to Rita. I don't think there's any specific questions that I have to answer, so go ahead, Rita.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to talk about this from a different angle, and I want to start by telling you a story about a failure, and it was a failure of mine to get a grant. in that grant, I believe it was called a SHRC. But I sometimes think in academia, we don't talk enough about things that, I like that term that you use, Nicole, unsuccess. Maybe that should be it. Not failure, unsuccess. But it seems to me that we can learn an awful lot from why things sometimes don't appeal to other people. And the way that the SHRC happened was, you used to have to go, I don't know whether it's like this now, Perry, you probably would know. You'd have to go and give a 6-minute spiel to the committee who you would have assumed had read your work. And it was a very interesting experience. Before I sat down, the committee member said, your 6 minutes has started. And I said, but I haven't sat down yet. It's like, so we had this back and forth. There's 20 minutes gone, not smart. But then we got to the content. And not only did one committee member not like my theoretical approach, they told me that I didn't understand the work of Hannah Arendt, who I actually did my PhD on, but you know, we beg to differ, right? But they didn't like my methodology. Why on earth was I using phenomenology? Why wasn't I using an intersectional analysis, right? So before I left that room, I knew that I'd failed for this particular project. And I just want to say publicly, thank you to Perry, because when I found out that it wasn't successful, Perry had all these great suggestions about how I should go and talk to people in arts and humanities, which is where I did my PhD, so that they could help me shape what I was doing in a way that would be richer and perhaps closer to what it was I was trying to do. Anyway, I ignored Perry's advice and instead went on a different route and came up with a very different project. And that project was about gender-based violence policies in Ontario, and looking at the ways in which policies are implemented within universities. So Jen, could you go forward with these slides? Yeah.
Quite a bit forward.
Yeah, bit forward. I think I'm at number 11. Okay, so, okay, from failure to success. What do we need to do to be successful? Well, obviously we need to tell a good story. And I needed to tell my story in a way that I hadn't before, right? In a way that not only made sense to me, but made sense, as Nicole was saying, to people from very different disciplinary perspectives than yourself. To do that, you need lots of background preparation. And it strikes me now in reflecting on why I didn't get the other grant, was I hadn't actually spent enough time in really thinking through what it was that I wanted to do. Okay, so I learned from that, and I didn't make the mistake when I was putting the IDG together. So take your time, and it takes a lot of time. I think for me, you know, after that negative experience that I told you about, I then got a very small grant from the faculty, which enabled me to hire 2 graduate students, Haley and Candice, who were really, really instrumental in helping to develop the literature review. And that is so important, I think, that you have a strong literature review. And I would say that because I'm from arts and humanities. But anyway, the other thing, as Nicole said, like, talk to your colleagues, find out from them what they think made their grant successful. And one of the things that I learned from Melody, and we laugh about this all the time now, is to have phases, right? So when you write about what you're going to do, have 3 phases. In phase 1, I'm going to do this. In phase 2, I'm going to do this. In phase 3, I'll do this. And that way, the committee can see that you do have a plan. It's not just a plausible fiction, which it seems to me that a lot of grants are. But then I'm not a grant writer by trade. The other thing I would say is attend SSHRC presentations. Now, SSHRC presentations, in my view, can be rather boring. They're very long. 90 minutes is not uncommon, but you can find out things that you don't know. And I didn't know about HQP, which stands for highly qualified personnel, and how important it is to talk about how you're going to give your students the knowledge and training that will be useful to them as they proceed into their career. As Nicole said, budget carefully. This is something whereby, talking to other colleagues, I was surprised at the kind of minutia in terms of detail that a committee will go into, but they do. And so I think it's really important not only to make friends in your faculty, across faculty. I think it's also really important to make friends with people in finance, because if you're not great with numbers, then they will help you, as will the research office, and everyone in the research office has been very helpful to me. The other thing that I think is really important is to ensure that your theoretical framework and your methodological approach makes sense, and not just to you. And so, for instance, I work with 2 collaborators, one at Lakehead University and the other in critical policy, Melody Vixo. And each of us has a very different perspective. Melody is big on policy. I do feminist theory and practical phenomenology. And Jennifer at Lakehead is a feminist sociologist. And together we crafted what is a very novel approach to policy, which is to take Sarah Ahmed's work. Some of you may know Sarah Ahmed's work and she sees herself as a practical phenomenologist, and to put that together with Dorothy Smith's feminist sociology, which is also known as institutional ethnography. And I actually think that this was something that the committee liked. The project was very highly ranked because it was novel. No one had done this before. So that was really interesting, and it's been very interesting to work on this project. And don't forget about the knowledge mobilization piece. Again, the knowledge mobilization piece was new to me. These are terms that I didn't understand, and I'm sure that Deanna will talk a little bit more about them. So I'll keep that short. If we can go on to the next slide. The final thing I want to say is be very careful what you wish for. At the same time as I applied as a PI to do this grant in the Faculty of Education, I was also applying as a collaborator on a grant with someone in Waterloo who's a philosopher. And that grant was on Hannah Arendt and questions of home and belonging. Never in my wildest dreams did I expect that both grants would succeed. They did. It's been a very busy 3 years as I've had to move between 2 really different projects, but it's been fascinating. So, to end, never let failure put you off. Again, I don't think we talk enough about failure or unsuccess in the faculty, and I think we should, because we can learn so much more and help each other from it. And at the end of the day, We're telling a story. So make sure that yours is compelling. Thank you.
I'm wondering, Jen, if I maybe can take control of the presentation because I have a number of animations and it might be, thank you. All right. So I'm going to talk about this from the other side of the table, as Perry mentioned. I had my first opportunity to sit on a SSHRC committee last spring, and my experience is perhaps different than what you might have experienced had you sat on a committee in previous years because of COVID. So I'll try to sort of talk about what some of those changes might have been, and anticipate perhaps what might be happening this year, with the recognition that it's something to specifically talk to SSHRC about in terms of their research officers, but it is something to be thinking about. So, you know, the way I'm sort of trying to frame this is thinking about, you know, I'm listening to your story, I'm reading your story, I'm trying to understand your story, and then I either have to sell your story or not sell your story. Right. And so when you're thinking about how you're telling me that story, you want to be very intentional, because you're telling me your story and 15 other people are telling me their story as well. Right. So what you really want to be thinking about is, at the end of the day, what are your take home messages that you want me to go to the committee with, in terms of, you know, what you're planning to do, why it's going to be successful, and how it's going to contribute. Right. Because what will happen is I will evaluate it, I will give it my full attention, I will spend a couple hours reading it, but once I've rated it and we go to committee meetings, and the committee meetings are approximately 12 hours total to get through all of the files, your file will get 5 minutes for me to talk about it if I'm the first reader, and like 3 minutes for you to hear about it from the second reader. And what's been allotted to your file is 10 minutes total of the committee's time to make decisions about the ranking of your file in terms of the grade that it's given. So you really want to be mindful of how I use those 5 minutes I have to share your story. What is it you want me to be able to say to them? And what are some really key strengths of what you are doing that I can convey to the committee and convey to my fellow readers to argue on your behalf that your rating should be better than what it ends up being when we average it across the readers, right? So if I feel strongly about your proposal, I will go in and I will advocate for it, and I will suggest maybe you should have a higher rating. If, on the other hand, I come in with questions or I come in with limitations, then I'm not a very good advocate for you, and you want me to be a good advocate for you. So how can you do that? First, you want to think about who's reading your application, right? So you heard Nicole and Rita speak about making sure you're as clear as possible, and there's an important reason for that. I could be reading Nicole's application. I could be reading Rita's application. You heard how different they are, right? I don't have expertise in either of their fields. There's 2 or 3 readers. We're an expert in the panel. We can talk about social work. So I was on the education and social work panel. I could also have sat on the psychology panel, but this is a very broad panel, right? There's a lot of diversity, a lot of expertise. There is really not a lot of expertise directly in your specific field and in how detailed you get in the type of questions that you ask. So you need to really tell me what it is you're doing so that I can then convey it to somebody else. And that's kind of why I had those 2 tin cans, because sometimes information can get lost in translation if you're not as clear as you possibly could be. The other thing is that the person reading it could be primarily quantitative or primarily qualitative. So how you write your proposal really shouldn't differ too much on whether or not you're a quantitative researcher or a qualitative researcher in terms of how clear it is, right? Because I need to be able to understand your analysis process regardless of which type of researcher you are. So you want to make sure that that's as clear as possible. Certainly it might be different features for the 2, but you need to make sure that it's written in a language that me as a quantitative researcher could understand if you're a qualitative researcher, because they don't divide files into a quantitative and a qualitative pile. We could also have any language background. So you have to be able to adjudicate in both English and French, but you might have a first language other than English and French. So I had to read a few files in French, and that was fine. But in the conversation, I was speaking in English, but I was listening to other people whose first language was French speaking in French. It was a fabulous opportunity. I enjoyed it quite a bit. We were also speaking over a conference telephone with where we were muted when we weren't speaking, but that has the possibility to, again, cause communication breakdowns. So you want to make sure that everything I'm conveying is as clear as possible. And so that's really quite important. And we're all reading approximately 15 applications each, and we're all being asked to use the rubric that SSHRC has given us very closely. Okay, so what Nicole was talking about in terms of looking at challenge, feasibility, and capability, if we're talking about the file, when it's our turn to talk about the file, and we're not using those terms, the chair sort of politely interrupts and says, could you talk about it with respect to these 3 spaces? And they really want us to use that. So you want to make sure that you're helping the readers pick your applications as the ones that they want to advance for funding. Okay, and so part of it could be the case that I have 15 applications that are all excellent and I want to promote all of them. But at the same time, you want to make sure you're at the top of that pile. So it's really important to shape your message. The very first thing that you take, at least that I take a look at when I'm reading proposals, is the proposal summary. Okay, so this is really your opportunity to get your readers excited about your research. You want the person to go, yes, I want to read these 20 pages or however long it is. You don't want them to go, oh my goodness, what am I in for? So you really want to get them excited about the potentials for your project. So you want that clear research question to come through with the anticipated impact. What is the answers to these questions going to enable us to understand better or enable us to do in society? You want to make sure there's a clear link between the research question and the methodology, and that there's not any concerns about the feasibility of answering your research question based on the fact that the methodology doesn't quite fit. And you want to have a clear plan on how to achieve that success. So all of that really should be articulated in that summary so that when I read the greater detailed proposal, I'm really looking for evidence to support what you've sort of told me is going to be what you're going to do. And what I highlight is that when I go into this meeting, I have to speak about 15 proposals. That's a lot on my working memory to try to remember all of them at once, right? So what we do is we get a list of what order we're going to speak in, but I can't go back and flip through your whole proposal. I write a summary of what I think, and I'll read that summary. But if I'm going to refer to anything, I'll refer back to your proposal summary. So that's really helpful for me to just twig my memory of the key things, look at the notes I've taken, and then formulate what I want to say about your proposal to the larger group. So you really need it to be accessible and you need it to be persuasive, right? So that I can access it and so that I can be persuasive on your behalf. I don't know if we have any established scholars in our room today, but I would highlight that for established scholars, you really need to make a clear case that what you're proposing is a new line of research. Explain how the research is different. Don't assume that the reader is going to make the conceptual leap. If you're in the same field and it feels to the committee that it's all within ABA, for example, applied behavioral analysis, we can't really discern whether or not it's actually different unless you tell us it's different. And so you really want to make sure that you're saying, this is how it's new, this is how I'm going to be moving outside my line of research. And if the committee can't see that it's a novel project, your applications automatically fails. So that's practically like the second page of the proposal. And if people go, I can't see this, they automatically have to fail it on challenge, in which case nothing else matters. Okay, so that's sort of the biggest issue, I think, for established scholars. And it's also, I think, the area that they spend a lot less time on compared to other parts of the proposal. So obviously a very important section. The rest of your application needs to keep providing evidence in service of your main message. Okay, so again, you really need to be thinking about, what are my main messages with respect to the challenge, the feasibility, and the capability I have to do this project. And if I'm providing information that doesn't speak to any of the criteria that Nicole put on the screen, then the committee doesn't know quite what to do with it because we're asked to work within the confines of those criteria. So in terms of scoring your application, this is a little bit of a look behind the curtain, except that you're given this information. So really make use of it. But here's the scoring system, which in all honesty is quite confusing. A score of 1 is the highest score that you can get. And when we go in through and score, we're actually told, give a score with 2 decimal places. So score it as 3.56. And so you do that for each of these particular areas. And what's actually quite helpful, if you're not a math person, is you get an Excel sheet that actually calculates the weightings of these for you. So you score them on each of these 3 things, and then it'll give you your average score for that person, weighting it with 50% challenge, 20 for feasibility, and 30 for capability. And then the other thing that's really kind of great about this specific grant, so we're talking about Insight Development Grant here, is that there's 2 separate pots of funds for emerging scholars and for established scholars. And so what that means is we can't steal from the other pot. Okay, so we have a set amount that is designated to our committee for each group, and then depending on how much money is available, the top scorers get that money up to a certain point when all the money is spent. And that's the way it goes. And we'll keep moving that line down until all the money is spent. The only way that somebody above the line, they're not even really above the line, but there's the possibility that if you fail on any one of these 3 areas, you're automatically disqualified, even if your score would have been above the line, okay, which doesn't really happen. But basically, they'll keep funding until all the money is spent. And so, you could have people who are funded in the satisfactory good area if there's still money to be done. So as long as you haven't received an unsatisfactory in any one of those 3, there's the possibility to be funded. And honestly, I think just depends on the year and the pot of people, pot of applicants that are there and what they're asking for. So that's pretty key. So one of the things that we're asked to do in the scoring is to sort of identify whether or not we think the application could be successful, or if we think that it'll have important outcomes. And it actually, the rubric that we're given is interesting because it says, we have 1 concern, or we have 2 concerns, or we have 3 concerns. And obviously the more concerns that you have, the lower scored you're going to get. And so I think my biggest advice would be avoid creating red flags, or avoid putting out information that you don't then return to. So here's some examples of some red flags that might really get the person talking about the issues in your application as opposed to the strengths. So 1 red flag, the timeline doesn't seem feasible in terms of what you've said you're going to do and how much time you have to do it. The sample size might seem small for the type of question you're asking. Maybe you're trying to generalize your findings to a really large audience or large population, and you've told us you're only going to interview 5 people, right? That's something where we question that. The budget can be either too big or too small, right? So if both of them are problematic, right? If it's too big, it feels like it's padded, and then if we cut a certain amount, then it automatically has to fail. And off the top of my head, I'm not recording this, I'm not quite sure what it is. I think it's 25%, but people can correct me if that's wrong. But if it's too big, that's an issue. If it's too small, we don't see it as feasible. So again, that really impacts the feasibility. The methodology doesn't align with the research question, meaning that the challenge in terms of answering the research question really hasn't been met. Team members lack expertise. So I'll just go back to Nicole's example there, because I think it's an excellent example. She talked about working with Anton, and because her project specifically had to do with STEM research and she doesn't have that expertise in STEM, if she had made this proposal without that expertise, that might have been a red flag, okay? If the research project was something that was completely within her area of expertise and she didn't have any collaborators, that would not be a red flag, because there's not a mismatch between the question and the personnel. So it doesn't really matter if you've got, at least from my perspective on the adjudication committee, how many people you have just really has to align with the question that you're asking and the scope of your project, okay? And they have to align. Team members are lacking time to contribute to the project. So you might have a bunch of people on your team. You might have a really strong established researcher, let's say you're an emerging one, but you've sort of indicated somebody who, when you look at their CV and you look at what you say they're going to be able to do given what they already do, if there's a mismatch between thinking that that person can actually be a good contributor, that might be a red flag. It might be that team members' roles are ill-defined. So in that case, you could have multiple people who all have the exact same expertise, and it looks like somebody's just on the grant because, they're friends, as opposed to they're going to contribute something. And it doesn't necessarily, so one of the things you want to really be mindful of is that you have to fill out the Canadian Commons CV. We look at that to look at capability, but written within the grant, you have to sort of leverage what it is in that CV that allows that person to be a successful member of the team. And don't expect me to comb through your CV to figure that out. You have to tell me that and make that argument that they should be there and this is what they're going to do. The other thing in terms of resources is thinking about, not that knowledge mobilization piece. I am by no means an expert in knowledge mobilization. I was mentioning to some colleagues just yesterday that the Knowledge Exchange School is currently going on main campus with a number of really wonderful online seminars. The one the other day was on talking about your scholarly impact and measuring it. One of the things I want to really highlight here is you want to make sure that anything that you're suggesting you're going to do in terms of knowledge mobilization, knowledge exchange is supported by the resources that you have, right? So don't say I'm going to do a brand new website and then don't specify what resources are going to be available for that. So maybe the resources are, that you are hiring an RA and part of their role is going to be to maintain that website. That being said, there are a lot of much more innovative ways we can talk about knowledge mobilization that may get more hits than a brand new website, right? So thinking about the resources that your university already has and maybe piggybacking on them to get your message out a little bit more. So be mindful of that, because if you're saying you're going to do something and we don't see the funding behind it, that's problematic as well, and it's a red flag. The last point I'm going to make is what I'm calling hanging threads. And it has to do with that detailed proposal to begin with. So both Rita and Nicole have really highlighted how important it is to be, and I have, accessible and to avoid jargon. The most frustrating applications to read are the ones that assume that you've taken a graduate class with that professor and know everything about their field, and that they've sort of talked about, I'm taking this framework or I'm taking this perspective, and then they don't define it and they expect you to know what that is. And, it really is beyond what I'm asked to do to then go to Google and try to figure out what do they mean by this? Because basically you've taken me out of your story and you've taken me out of your narrative. And you've sort of had me going, wonder what the next proposal is going to be, right? And you don't want your reader thinking that. You really don't. So you want to make sure that everything is really well defined. And I would say that education, and this is my own personal opinion, but the breadth of the expertise across the panels and the 3 panels that are there are very, very different and very wide. And we see that in our own Faculty of Education, right? So it's really important to recognize that I could be reading anybody in our faculty's proposal, and you need to really, recognize that I can read it with a very critical and discerning eye, but you have to hold my hand and make sure you take me where you want me to go and not where I wander off to. When you introduce literature, you want to make sure that its relevance is really specified. Why are you telling me this? Because one of the things that often happens in the context piece is you've given somebody information because you think that they need to know about a specific part of the literature, but you don't have enough time in your 5 pages to actually go into any detail. So you've sort of introduced it, then you've left it hanging, and there's not enough information for the reader to understand why it's important. So you're better off just taking it out and simplifying your story a little bit, or really thinking about that piece and going, why is it relevant? Is there somewhere else I can work this into and think about it? One of the things that often happens too is that people get to the end and they realize, oh, now I have to talk about the methodology, right? The methodology is really key because it's what you're going to do. So I don't want to read 80% literature and 20% methodology. I really want it much more balanced than that, because when I go to sell it to the committee, I'm not going to talk about the literature background on your project. So if I'm not going to talk about the literature background, I'm talking about your question. I'm going to talk about why it's novel. And then I'm going to talk about how you're going to address it. But I'm not going to go into all of your theories. I don't have time. So recognize that you just really want to sell me on why it's novel, why is it a new methodology? And your literature review can absolutely do that. And to speak to Rita's point, it can absolutely do that in terms of saying this is novel, but you have to tell me why it's novel and why it's a good thing, okay? And then tell me how the methodology is going to help me with that, right? And if your reader can't envision how the study will unfold, you will not get a good score, because I need to imagine that I'm the researcher and this is what I'm going to do. Kind of like when you write your letter of information for a participant and you write it from the perspective of, these are all the things that you should expect to happen. I want to be able to be the researcher, to be able to sort of see what's going to happen. And then I can have a better understanding of what data you're going to get, how that's going to answer your question, and how I might anticipate you to analyze it. But then I'll read how you're going to analyze it, see if there's a connection there to what I would think, and then move forward with that. Okay, so you really need to make sure that all of the links are checked off between the research question, the methodology, the analysis plan, and your expected outcomes, and that you don't have any of these hanging threads anywhere. Because if you do, when I go to speak about your project for 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about all of the red flags and the hanging threads. I'm not going to talk about your strengths. So that's what you want me to talk about. You want to make sure that all of this is taken care of. So all I can say is, I really love this project. I really love the way they've tackled doing it, and I think they can do it, and they have the capability and feasibility to do it within the time frame that they've set. And if you can sell me on that, then I can sell the committee. Otherwise, you find yourself, in the middle of the pack, or maybe at the bottom of the pack, and then you just don't quite get, where you want to be. Okay. And I think that is all I had to say, so I will stop sharing.
Okay, thank you to the presenters. Those were great talks. I appreciated those. Thank you very much for your practical focus. I think you've given some really concrete advice that people will be able to apply. Thanks for your frankness as well. I thought I was pretty raw, but that was some quite direct advice. And related to that, thanks also for your attention to the issue of unsuccess. Because I think that, that distinction between roughly the 2/3 of proposals that are not successful and roughly the 1/3 of proposals that are successful is one that we really need to hear about. A couple other points I picked up from the presentation that I've also noticed as a reviewer and as an applicant, and I really want to kind of underscore the importance of coherence in a proposal. And the idea of not having those hanging threads. So for example, HQP, the way you handle HQP throughout your proposal, making sure that what you say about HQP in training is consistent with what you say about HQP in your budget and budget justification. So for example, if you're going to take your graduate students to conferences, making sure that you budget to take them to conferences, and then that becomes a valuable part of their training. Another part that I would underscore is the importance of focus. When I've seen really unsuccessful applications, it's often been because the researchers tried to do too many different things in one proposal or project. So there should be that possibility of being able to say pretty concisely what it is you're trying to do in your project. Also, the point about balance of lit review versus method. This is something that we see also in internal grant applications. Sometimes we see really long lit reviews and a short method, and it's really important to provide that concrete description of your research activities, because that's what's going to allow the committee to understand what you're actually going to do and evaluate its strength. And also understand your budget, right? Because your budget should be consistent with your research activities. So when you describe your method, in a way, you're also justifying your budget. Finally, coming back to that theme of unsuccess, the importance of stepping up to the plate again and again. Something we've seen with several of our researchers is they'll submit a proposal. It may not be successful. They do some revisions and then they resubmit the proposal. And often it's successful on the second try or even the third try. So it can be worthwhile to step up to the plate again. So we want to allow some time for questions. And I see Deanna also has her hand up. But first I want to ask the presenters a question. That is, we've had the request, is it okay to share your slides? Are you okay with your slides being shared?
Sure.
Okay, great. So now I'll open it up for questions, and I wonder if people could write their questions into the chat, and then the presenters could pick up those questions from the chat and address them. Does that sound good? Is that okay with you, Rita?
You're muted, Rita.
I just said I like hearing people's voices, but I'm cool either way. Doesn't matter.
Oh, okay, okay. Okay, good. So if people indicate in the chat they want to ask a question, I'll call on them, and then you can hear their voice. So shall we hear from Deanna and then go to our chat?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up one thing that I had forgotten that I wanted to say when both Nicole and Rita were speaking, which was that last year for SSHRC Insight Development Grant, no feedback was actually given because of COVID. So people just got their scores and they did not get anything else, which is unfortunate because, you know, if somebody failed at a section, we couldn't articulate why they failed. I don't know what the protocol is going to be this year for adjudications for SSHRC, but it's probably something to be mindful of, particularly if you were able to ask at a SSHRC presentation.
Yeah. So I see that Ruslan has a long question. So go ahead, Ruslan.
Hi, everyone. I would like to first thank Nicole, Rita, and Deanna for your presentations. Very informative. My question is not that long, but I thought it would be faster just to ask it using the microphone as opposed to writing it. It's more, I guess, related to the logistics of applying for a grant. So I think Nicole and Deanna, you two mentioned that having a grant as a single author is probably not necessarily a good idea. If you have a team, it is viewed favorably if people have complementary expertise. So my question is, if I want to collaborate with, let's say, another professor at a different university, is there one principal investigator, or can two people be co-investigators? And if so, when they submit the grant, do they submit the grant at the same time for both institutions, or one of them has to decide, or they have to decide who will be submitting it? And if so, what implications does it have for a researcher?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Perry, but oftentimes one university does the submission, right? Rather than shared submissions between universities. And typically there's a nominated principal investigator and then co-investigators, but it could also depend on the particular grant. At least for this one, I think there's a PI, so a principal, and then there are co-investigators, and the person who is listed as PI would do the submission and take charge of that. And then those others would be listed as co-investigators.
Yeah, that's correct. There's
I think
principal
that's a really good, sorry.
Yeah, that's correct. There has to be a principal investigator. And you can indicate within the proposal that you're sharing the responsibility, you know, more or less equally. but yeah, nominally there has to be that PI. But Rita wanted to say something.
Yeah, just with my experience, it's been quite interesting, because one of the universities where, you know, the other person is a PI is Waterloo, but Waterloo and Western share things. So that's been really easy. With the other university is Lakehead, and things have not been as easy, because going through research ethics, it took me 6 months at Western.
Wow.
And then at Lakehead, it took another 6 months to go through research ethics. So it was a complete waste of time. Thank goodness they are now changing what they do at Lakehead. But I know that's not your question, but it's something to think about, because it puts you behind, right? The things that you expect to do, because you think, oh, it's going to take 4 months to do research ethics, and then it takes a year. Well, you know, that can be a problematic. The other thing I wanted to say is I'm rather frustrated that two people can't both have equal kudos. Certainly the thing that we're doing together, we're writing a book. Can you believe it? SSHRC actually gives money for the writing of books, at least in philosophy. Not sure it does in education. But we're equal. But you can't be that, right? There's a hierarchy to it. And, you know, universities want it because universities want the money, right?
Yep. My question was more, I guess, in terms of, I understand if co-PI-ship, if I may say that, not possible, if one person has to be a PI, I understand that the person who lists himself or herself as a PI, that person and that university gets like more benefits in a way, right? I don't know how it's counted for like reporting purposes, for example, the faculty's ability to bring in money. If I'm listed as a co-PI for a professor, let's say at the University of Saskatchewan, will Western be counted in that, or will all the credit go to that PI? Because I was on some grants where we applied both as co-directors or co-PIs, but I know that other grants they require that you indicate only one person as a PI, another person serves as a co-PI, so kind of in a secondary role. So it sounds like with this specific grant, there has to be one person who is listed as a PI, and then the rest of the team is okay. Thank you so much for the explanation.
Yeah, and some there are ones where I think that funds can go through different institutions, but this one is here's the PI, and then you can list a co-investigator.
Okay.
And the other thing that's nice to see as an adjudicator is some sort of indication of the percentage of time each person is going to be working on that particular grant. So you can get a sense within the application itself that it'll be a 50-50 split, and here's my role and here's the other person's role. What I would say is I don't think the adjudication committee really prioritizes, collaboration over the other in this particular grant. It's a smaller grant in the grand scale of things. I think what's really prioritized is that there's that alignment between the capability and the question and the feasibility, right? So you can apply as a person by yourself if you can demonstrate that you have the skills to make it happen. And I don't think, particularly as like if you're an earlier stage researcher, that I don't think is seen as directly negatively. It's only negative we don't think it's feasible for you to do it.
Yeah, it's a couple other things that can be done to sort of offset that issue of one person being the PI is that money can be shared across institutions. So if the grant initially flows to you, for example, at Western, but you have a collaborator at another university, then money can flow to them to support their research assistants, et cetera. Also, in terms of your products, when you're publishing, one person could be first author on some publications, the other person can be first author on other publications. So in that way, credit becomes more balanced across different people. Now I see Tatiana's had her hand up. So what did you want to ask about, Tatiana?
Thank you, Perry. One question and one comment, if I may. And I know we've said a lot about speaking about failures or unsuccesses. To add to that conversation, another yay, let's do it. I think it's just so paramount for emergent scholars that we hear these stories, because often when we look at the senior faculty member at our advisors, what we see is that multi-year established, cleverness, this polished, I don't want to use the word product, but, this a platform of this incredible thought and success. And it's really nice to know that it's not instant, or it's not without failure, or it's not without labor. So I do hope that we continue in whatever conversations we have, outside of this one, to kind of bring that up as a topic, because it's just, it's so paramount. And I think it just makes you feel like you could actually get somewhere, that others too are human. And my very quick question, if I may, Deanna, is to you. Just in your work as adjudicator, you mentioned capabilities, obviously, and you also very briefly mentioned CVs. Is CV review actually part of the work that you do as an adjudicator, or does it come at some later stage?
No, they give us the Canadian Common CV, so we get a chance to look at that. So feel good that the time that you spend filling that one out actually gets to the reviewer's site. So I think it's the last 6 years that are considered in terms of what your application looks like. So but it will cut you off when you're filling that out. So we're given sort of your full application and the CV. Obviously, it's adjudicator's sort of decision about how much time they spend looking at various things and what their approach is. My approach was to read the application in its entirety, sort of figure out what I felt like the researcher needed to be able to do in order to be successful, and then take a look to see how they've articulated that in the application in terms of talking about their strengths, and then looking at the Canadian Commons CV to confirm that, as opposed to spending a lot of time looking through it. Because if you do that, it can feel a little bit like a numbers game where you're just counting up how many grants they have and all this and that. And that's really not ideal. Rather, what you want to see is, if you're an emerging scholar, that there's some publications in the field that you're asking for money and that you've shown some success and that you're at a good point for your career stage. One of the things I think is really great about this particular grant in and of itself is we look at the emerging and the established separately. So we're not comparing apples with oranges. We're comparing people at similar career stages. And there's an equal amount of money, I think, for each of those groups. So it really does allow for more success for emerging. And the other thing I would say is they've also sort of done something to like pull the established people back, because they're required to jump into something new. So when you're looking at the applications, they haven't had as much thought sometimes, I think, in terms of, they're not experts in the new place that they're going. And so sometimes that leads to a little bit of unpolish. Yeah.
Oh, yay for the little guy. Thank you so much again, to know to hear all of your insights, but also to know how much work you as reviewers put in the process. It's so appreciated and humbling, because we often hear about the lack of time and the elevator pitch and all of that, but often it seems that the reviewers are sort of come in that from a position as, I don't even care, you have to make me pull my earplugs out of my ears, and it's clearly not the position. I mean, from your presentation was so obvious just how much in the corner of the researcher you start the review process from, and it's keeping you there as opposed to pulling you in a sense, and it's just wonderful. Thank you.
I just wanted to comment on the failure piece too. At least the year I was funded, I think it was like 50% of emerging, or maybe even 60% of emerging scholars were funded. So this is one where you're less likely to feel failure. So it's a good one. Like I've applied for a number of CIHR grants because my research bridges both gaps, and their funding rates are tiny, but I keep trying, because it's good funding. But this is one where, at least in other competitions, you might feel more failure, but this one, you're less likely to feel that. So it's good. And it's a good starting point for a grant as well.
Yeah, something we've really been encouraging with our faculty members is to kind of follow those stepping stones. So starting with internal research grants and then going to something like a SSHRC Insight Development Grant, where there's that opportunity for early career faculty members, and then moving on to other grants that are sort of larger and maybe a bit more competitive, like SSHRC Insight grants and so on. And yeah, CIHR is notoriously brutal. So are there other questions for the presenters?
There's one in the chat.
Yeah, Donna Swat. So Donna, do you want to talk about your question?
Uh, sorry guys, I am using my cell phone. I usually use my computer, but I've been on my computer all day and I just wanted to rest my back on my couch. So this is the question I have. I had a couple questions before, but I just put one in the chat box, and I'm approaching SSHRC. I'm new to SSHRC because I came into the faculty as an international student. So by the time I became a PR and eligible for SSHRC projects, I was well into my doctoral degree. And I'm defending my PhD in a matter of months. I'm actually preparing for a tenure track faculty position coming up next Tuesday. And so I thought I would sit in to learn more about SSHRC. So of course, I'm going to be doing my own reading. So specifically, the question that I've placed in the chat is about the emerging versus established scholars. And I'm wondering if every PI in that application must be considered emerging in order to fit into the emerging category, and likewise for the established, or what if as a new scholar, I want to do a collaboration with an established researcher, where would that application fit?
Yeah, Deanna, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. It really is who is the principal investigator. So if the principal investigator is emerging, then it can be considered in the emerging funding package. What I would say, just in terms of possible red flag, is if you are continuing to work with your PhD supervisor and the two of you are together on a grant and you put yourself forward as an emerging scholar and they're sort of on the grant as either a co-investigator or somebody who has a lot of input into the grant, and you're continuing on with the same research that you did as part of your graduate work, it depends on the person. But for me, when I look at something like that, it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like you're really emerging as that principal investigator yourself. It really has to show progression. So I would be a little bit mindful about those types of partnerships, because what possibly could have happened is the other person could have put themselves as PI in terms of being the established person, and then the application would have been immediately rejected because it's not new enough. So there were a couple discussions around that as a concern, but with specific reference to your question, it's whoever the principal investigator is how it gets categorized.
Yeah, I have a question for Deanna as well. Of the applications that were successful, how many were single author versus multiple applicants? Like just ballpark.
Yeah. In all honesty, I don't think I could even ballpark that. I don't think it was the main factor that determined if people were successful or not.
There were some single authored ones though that were successful.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, for sure. And I guess I'm a little bit biased on this. Maybe I don't work well with others, but both of my grants, I was sort of the lone person on it. So it's certainly possible. So I think it just really, again, comes down to the alignment piece. Can you articulate that you can do it by yourself?
Other questions for the presenters? Okay, well, not seeing any more questions, so I'll just thank you again. All three of those talks were really helpful, as well as the answers to our questions. So I appreciate that, and I think that you'll help people to be successful in applying for SSHRC Insight to grant development grants this year. So thank you very much.